Hey, let's try this again. So it'll be my third attempt making this video, and hopefully don't have that weird noise. So what I'm going to do is work through 15 problems and kind of give you hints of how to solve each problem, and I'll also tell you the correct answers. So in number 1 here, we're looking for a change in DNA that will cause a heritable germline mutation. So heritable here means that's going to be able to be inherited from the parent to the offspring. In germline, remember, a germ cell is a type of cell that's a precursor to producing a gamete. So let's look at our options here. Option A mentions bone cells, and those are going to be bodily or somatic cells, so those cannot be passed on to offspring. Same thing with B and D. Skin cells and liver cells are not gametes. Those are bodily cells or somatic cells, so even if there are mutations in those, they can't be passed on to offspring. However, a sperm cell does contain genetic information that is passed on to offspring, so the correct answer would be C. Number 2, reviewing enzyme reactions. Remember, enzymes speed up chemical reactions, and a student is looking to see how substrate or reactant amount, so how much reactant affects the rate of the enzyme. So which 3 things should the student be kept constant? The answers are temperature of the reaction, pH of the reaction, and then the amount of enzyme. C and D are not correct because C is the independent variable. That's what the student's changing on purpose. And D is going to be the dependent variable because substrate is converted into product. And so that's going to be the data the student will be collecting is the amount of product produced. So in number 2, the correct answers are A, B, and E. Number 3 here shows you a cell, or model of a cell. And we can see that it has several organelles. It has a nucleus. It does not have that boxy appearance of a plant cell, and it has a lysosome. So this is going to be an animal cell. So we're going to see which 3 cell types can be represented by this model. So we're going to look for cell types that aren't bacterial and aren't plant. So human stem cell, sea urchin embryo, and mammalian white blood cell are the correct answer. Plant xylem cell and bacterial cell would not be correct because a plant cell would have a cell wall and would not have a lysosome. Bacterial cells would not have a nucleus, along with most of these other organelles. Going to number 4, we have a nice model here, or flow diagram of the carbon cycle, and asking which change would lead to higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So what would be producing more carbon dioxides? And that would be C, an increase in the burning of fossil fuels. Everything else would lower carbon dioxide amounts, but the burning of fossil fuels, like we talked about, would increase them. Now, questions 5 through 8 are about a passage that we actually kind of discussed in class with the green sea slug that consumes the algae, and that the sea slug is actually able to incorporate the DNA of the algae into its DNA so it can also produce or perform photosynthesis. So it gives you an article here, some information, the life cycle of the sea slug, a data table here showing oxygen production and use by the sea slug, and we have our questions. So question 5 is this asking how is that sea slug able to produce its own food, and the correct answer is C. Now the reason it's C is, remember that relationship between photosynthesis and respiration. So when the sea slug isn't consuming food for energy, it is able to perform photosynthesis because of that DNA that it has spliced into its own DNA. And so it makes glucose during photosynthesis and then breaks that glucose down for respiration. Number 6, which property would give the green sea slug the capability to incorporate the genes of the algae into its own DNA? So we are talking about DNA here. We're not talking about photosynthesis or respiration. And so remember, no matter the living organism, no matter the species, all species, if they have DNA, have what's called the universal genetic code. And so that's that central dogma of DNA to RNA to protein. So all living things that have DNA That DNA is constructed from nucleotides. And remember, that's the sugar, phosphate, nitrogen base. So all living things use the same 4 nitrogen bases of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, or those A's, T's, G's, and C's that we talked about. And so the correct answer for 6 would be D. They both use the same nucleotides in their DNA. Number 7, looking at that data table, and so you would compare oxygen use and oxygen production. And the correct answer for 7 is A. So remember that relationship between photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis splits water and produces oxygen, and then oxygen is going to be used during respiration to help break down glucose to produce ATP. Number 8, you would look at the life cycle of the sea slug, and this one's pretty easy. You would just look at which stage is the sea slug most likely able to carry out photosynthesis. So when has it incorporated the chloroplast or the DNA into its own DNA? And that would be D, as the pigmented adult. Now, a lot of times they might have 2 separate readings or like an extension. So this is part 2. It's still about the algae and the sea slug, and the incorporation of the algae's DNA into that of the sea slug. And one thing I might do here, since it's on paper, I might identify these as the algae and then these as the sea slug. So number 9 is a tricky question. What you would do is probably narrow it down between A and B. C and D are not correct. And it's not A. Most of you would probably choose A because that's what it's talked about. When the sea slug consumes the algae, it's able to get that DNA from the algae and it incorporates it into its DNA. However, the eggs portion here is what we want to focus on. So in order to be passed from generation to generation, it's going to be closer to this recent ancestor. So 9 is actually B. Number 10, wrapping up that section on part 2, you would just go back and look at this table here and use it to answer number 10, and that answer is A. Now, going on to 11, it's a totally separate question, again about carbon cycle, pretty easy diagram here. Remember, if an arrow is coming out, it's being produced. If an arrow is going in, it's being absorbed as a reactant. So which of those actions could lead to a reduction in atmospheric carbon? So we want to reduce how much CO2 is being emitted, and that would be D. We as humans could plant more trees, and that would reduce carbon dioxide in the air. Because trees perform photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide is a reactant for photosynthesis. Now, number 12, I really don't know why this is on the practice test. I had never actually heard of these types of services until I saw this. So if you see something like this on the test Tuesday, I'm sorry, I had never actually even heard of this. This is very specific, and I hate that they do this. They give you something super specific that, none of my colleagues had never heard of as well. But it is common sense if you think about it. So with the bee and the pollination, you have to look at what are called ecosystem services. And again, I had actually never heard of this. When I saw this practice test, I had to look it up. But it is common sense if you read the service and what the service means or what the service provides. So the correct answer here is A, B, and D. And if you just read what the description for that service, it makes sense. So A, B, and D. Number 13 here, thankfully, is something that we talked about before with ecological succession, where we talked about the 2 types of primary and secondary. And what I would want to do here is look at my model. So if I notice down here, I've got bare rock, which we definitely talked about. That's like our home-cooked meal. And we talked about two events that would cause primary succession. And we specifically talked about C, lava flow from a volcano or volcanic eruption. Or we looked at Mount St. Helens. And then the recession or retreat of a glacier. So the answer for number 13 would be C and E. All the other options are secondary succession. Moving to 14, just really some data analysis here. Nothing that you have to know about sharks or their catch rate. So you're just looking at this data table and interpreting it. And pretty obvious here that the correct answer is D. You can see in every year during the summer months, there are more sharks in the summer than there are compared to the winter. And lastly, for this video, looking at 15, something that we just finished talking about. So remember, meiosis produces gametes. Those gametes are reproductive cells. Each of those are haploid and are genetically diverse. So at the which of these three processes occur during meiosis? Crossing over would be one of them. Remember, crossing over specifically occurs in prophase 1 of meiosis 1. Formation of gametes or sex cells would be the second option. And then independent assortment that occurs during metaphase 1 of meiosis 1 would be the third option. So for 15, your answer would be A, C, and D. B and E would be answer choices for mitosis, not meiosis. And so this concludes my first video looking at numbers 1 through 15. And again, I hope this helps.